go back and retrofit to something else, simply because there are some very unique features that they may have put into place, whatever those might be. So it's just an important thing to kind of bring out there. Anybody else want to chime in on that one? Now, with the one thing to sort of mention with the build-to-suit that is important from the developer's point of view, this will, number one, reduce the risk because you've already got a tenant. Chances are it's going to make it a heck of a lot easier for you to get not only the construction loan but the permanent financing because you've already got the tenant, and probably even maybe a lower interest rate. But in turn, to what extent do you potentially pass along some of those savings to the build-to-suit tenant, or you even partner with them to some extent in terms of the deal structure for that property? And that's something, you know, to consider, because one of the things, we can kind of jump into this a little bit, but they talk about obviously from on the retailing side is how you may actually have a retailing company set up in a way of where they are also their own developer, and they will build their own sites, but then once they have them built, we'll actually sell them off and then lease it back, doing the sale lease back. Okay, so we can go ahead and talk about that while we're sort of, because you probably have heard that term before that you may have not really understood what is actually happening there. How many of you have heard the term before, sale lease back? Okay, so somebody that's heard the term before, what, you know, we've kind of described this whole thing of you as the developer come in like CVS, Walgreens, you know, a lot of the retail sort of folks tend to kind of go to this model, but there's nothing that precludes office space tenants from doing the same thing, that potentially they have their office space built for them, but yeah, they don't want to, the issue is they don't want to inherently, the tenant doesn't want to tie up maybe a lot of cash or a lot of their effectively debt capacity on the real estate.
Right.
Okay, that's really where kind of the issue is. They purposely are trying to do the antithesis to the McDonald's model of saying, we're not in the real estate business, we are in the selling, you know, medicinal drugs and that sort of thing, sort of business, or we're in whatever other sort of restaurant business, whatever it might be. We don't want to have to deal with the issues of effectively long-term aspects of owning the real estate. We want to keep it off of our balance sheets as a liability as well as an asset. Okay? Yep.
One thing to consider when you're looking at sale-leaseback is a lot of public companies, depending on their performance, you can look into if they own their real estate and determine if they're not performing very well, they might be willing to sell their property and lease it back because
absolutely.
They're not in the
to get the
business
cash
of owning.
infusion into the business.
Yes, and they take that out of their books. You know, it's better for their stock, and now
Yeah,
they have
it's kind of like a piggy bank, you know, to a certain extent. It's just sort of like, all right, you know, we've got this money sort of set aside in the asset, but yeah, there's a problem with that as well.
Yeah.
The problem is kind of like with the Sears thing, do you become a target for a hostile takeover? Okay, and this is something huge thing back in the 80s and early 90s. You heard of this whole thing of hostile takeover. Now, most corporations have put all sorts of things into play now to avoid these sort of situations, but it was this whole business of where you may have had assets combined were worth more than your business. That whole thing what I was saying earlier, your business is worth more dead than it is alive. You know, that if you've got all these real estate assets, all that it would take was somebody buying up your stock at a really cheap price, get a controlling interest in the company and say, okay, we're going to stop being whatever we were as a business, and now we're going to sell off all of the corporate assets, put everybody out of work that's working for the company, and, you know, go down that road. And, you know, and that's also kind of, you know, this goes beyond the real estate aspect, but I mean, and it is a legitimate issue. I'm not trying to minimize it, but, you know, you look at a company like a Sears or a, you know, a Radio Shack or, you know, formerly the Blockbusters and all those sorts of things. And, you know, how much of it, you know, if we look at it as cold, hard business people, developers, that sort of thing, we're just looking at it, this is a financial transaction. But yet there's that whole other dimension that, you know, goes beyond the scope of what we're really dealing with, which is the people dimension.
Right.
You know, all those hundreds of thousands of people that work at those stores, that no longer have jobs at those stores, that then have to potentially find new jobs or, you know, go in a totally different direction. And I'm not trying to minimize that, I'm not trying, you know, in any way to not say that that's not important, but yet, you know, there is that kind of trade-off of that you've got to say, if we have a business model and it's no longer working, you know, and it's clear we're going down this path where you know, it's going to be just, if we can stay open, but we're going to we're going to go bankrupt if we stay open. You know, how far do you have that sense of company loyalty to your employees? You follow what I'm saying? And I'm not saying I have the right answer to that, you know, because I think you could argue that point all day long as to, you know, how far do you go with that sort of situation. But at the same time, you know, it's one of the reasons why that you may have some of the companies saying, we don't want to be worth more dead than alive. You know, we would prefer that, you know, everything is kind of you know, lease agreements only. We don't want to own a lot of assets. We don't want to be in a situation of where someone could come in, take us over and sell off all our assets and that sort of thing. We prefer just not to be structured that way. Okay, thoughts? Okay, let's do kind of a basic example of sort of a sale leaseback and kind of give you a little bit of a perspective here of financially how this might work. So assume that you're like a Walgreens or a CVS and you're just going to be building kind of the standalone, you know, box store. It could also be a Best Buy or a, you know, it could be virtually any sort of retailer, or once again, get back to office space, which is where we were, of you're building this building for your use, okay? So you come in, you find the site, you purchase the site, you get all of the regulatory approvals for the site, you effectively have already done kind of your market analysis, you know, knowing that you're going to be entering into this market. And then you start and you do all of the construction for the property. And obviously you're going to be the one to occupy the property. Is that right? Yep. Okay, something doesn't look right for me. Okay. So anyway, so let's start up, you know, here with the site. That maybe you spend $1 million on the site, purchasing the actual site. You spend another, let's say, $7 million on the construction, and then you ultimately occupy the site. And then once you've got everything up and running, then you would engage in an absolute triple net lease by selling off but the key is a couple of things. One, our total investment up to this point for the site acquisition and the construction might be $8 million, but hopefully we can do what? Whenever we sell it to the third party that's buying it. Now usually these third parties are going to be institutions, like institutional investors, could be wealthy individuals that are just simply looking for a fixed income security, which is a huge market, believe it or not. You know, literally grandma, grandpa just collecting the checks for the next, you know, however many years. But the sale, ideally, you know, let's say that we could sell it for $10 million. So, you know, once again, not doing complicated math, you know, we effectively are able to sell it for $10 million. Our total investment up front with the construction, and the site acquisition is $8 million, so we score a $2 million profit. Now, with that $2 million profit, and we would get that money up front, okay, at the time of the closing of the sale and the execution of this lease. And normally, and we're going to talk about what we mean by absolute triple net lease, but we're probably going to engage in a 25-year lease. Okay, so that's a pretty long time horizon, all right? But this $2 million profit that we're able to achieve, and you're saying, well, how are we able to do that? Well, okay, first of all, the thought process is we found the location, we did all of the everything, okay? And so whoever's buying this, they're buying a fixed income security. They're really not even, well, they are buying the physical asset, they're really buying a cash flow stream, okay? Because, and the reason I'm trying to be very specific about this is what is meant by this term absolute triple net lease. A normal triple net lease is where, as the tenant, you would pay for most everything associated with the property in terms of your rent. You would pay for utilities, you're going to pay for the property taxes and the insurance and all that sort of stuff with the triple net lease, and the property owner pays for virtually nothing, okay? The difference with the absolute triple net lease is it even goes a step further and literally says, as the property owner, we pay for nothing. Nothing. I mean, it doesn't matter what it is. Basically somebody shoots out your windows, your responsibility as a tenant. Air conditioning stops working, too bad, so sad, use the tenant, pick up the tab. Parking lot needs to be resurfaced, too bad, so sad, use the tenant, deal with it. Literally anything and everything to deal with that property is taken care of by the tenant, okay? And so that the property owner literally is just, sitting, somewhere else in the world getting monthly checks that effectively are compensating them for their investment in this. And usually the kind of the discounted rate of return that they get is pretty small. It may only be a few percentage points, okay? It's not even a great, return. It's better than they would get in like sticking the money into a savings account or a CD or that sort of thing, but only incrementally so depending on where the market happens to be at that particular point in time. Okay, so we'll start with...
What's the difference between an absolute triple net and a ground?
Ground lease, you're just leasing the dirt.
Right,
okay?
Responsibility-wise.
It may be very similar,
right.
Okay? But with the ground lease, the idea is you're just leasing the dirt, and there's, so any sort of structures that are placed on the property, ultimately, depending on, once again, the duration of it, that would become ultimately the property of the actual owner. And in terms of the person who owns the land would ultimately become also the owner of the structures placed on that land at the expiration of that ground lease.
Right, in the absolute would be the same case.
It would, but with the absolute, it's just any and all responsibilities are going to be the tenants.
With the ground lease, so you still have to carry general liability on the property, whereas in an absolute, would that still be the case or no?
Yeah.
I don't, as the owner, I don't think you would have to carry any liability whatsoever on the space, because
They'll carry their own liability.
they're going to carry their own liability.
Right now, we're doing a Walgreens that was our in-house legal pulled his hair out because they were trying to figure out how they're going to structure the insurance, because the owner is free for risk, and that was one of the issues they were having is how do they structure it? Yeah. How do they structure it? Do they have to get an overall umbrella policy? Do they not? Do they have to insure the parking lot, bushes? How does it all lay out? They haven't gained an answer just yet.
Yep. Because normally, historically, as these things emerged, because it was the whole thing behind it that was threw off an awful lot of folks was this whole business of the absolute. And it was meant to be, we had created this animal. And Marcus and Millichap was at the forefront of a lot of this whenever this first got started. But the point was that they really wanted to create this structure that would allow some grandma somewhere, I mean, once again, to just kind of put it in terms, that is basically, all they're looking for is once a month I go to my mailbox and I get a nice check and I don't have to think about anything, if the building burns down, too bad, so sad, they gotta rebuild it, I'm gonna get my check.
That's essentially ground lease, right? I mean,
No.
You would get more revenue from a triple net lease than you would from a ground lease, because there's no improvements,
Right.
right?
Because there, yeah, you sort of make the assumption with the absolute triple net on the actual building itself,
Right.
you are getting the revenue from the building,
From the building
whereas
itself, yeah.
on the ground lease, you're just technically getting ground rent.
Right.
But to reach the term.
it's the same, right?
Yeah, a lot of the Walgreens, for example, in Weston, when Weston was developed originally, they are absolute net leases. For example, the Walgreens, it's owned by a guy that lives in Hawaii, and he doesn't really care what's going on or what happened to Walgreens. He gets a check every month. He doesn't have anything to do with the parking. He doesn't carry general liability, nothing. He built it, he rented absolutely net to Walgreens, and Walgreens takes
Right.
care of absolutely everything. The same with Cleveland Clinic. The Cleveland Clinic in Weston, they had multiple ancillary offices. All those offices are absolute net leases. And funny enough, when they were building their main facility, they sold and leased back their ancillary offices. And the reason to do that was to generate cash flow for them, but also because those ancillary offices needed repairs and needed upgraded. So they wanted to trespass that to a new owner and saying, okay, we sell it to you, you upgrade the facility and lease it back to us for the next 10 years.
Gotcha.
Or 20 years.
So, okay, yep.
I got a kind of question. What's an incentive for a tenant to sign up for something like this?
Because they're gonna get, first of all, in this particular case, they're gonna make $2 million profit off of this.
Oh, I understand that.
That's gonna be one of the big benefits, and they get that money, I'm about to go down that road. So give me 5 more minutes, and I think you're gonna have that question answered.
Okay.
So what I was about to say is, all right, they're selling this thing off for $10 million. So now let's put the numbers to it, okay? In terms of the deal. So assuming we're putting this into the calculator, we're putting it as 12 payments per year, and we put in $10 million is effectively the sale price, if you will. Okay, and the term of the lease, let's just go with 25 years. All right, now, then begins to be the interesting thing of, well, what is the interest rate we're going to use? Now, this is effectively the way to kind of think about this. What kind of return are we basically giving the purchaser of this building? And, this percentage is going to vary depending on, obviously, what prevailing interest rates are doing. So let's just use 5%, okay? We could probably go a little bit lower than that, but 5%, just nice, simple, round number. So 5% as our interest rate, and then solve for payment. Okay, it's about $58,000 a month. All right, times 12, just to get an annual figure, $701,000, 508. Okay, now, think about this for just a moment. You have just sold this property to this investor for $10 million. So you now have, as Walgreens or whoever, you've got $10 million cash money, correct? You've paid off the $8 million, so now you're left with $2 million of money that you can spend. Now, it may have tax implications, that sort of thing, but let's just, for the moment, ignore the tax implications and just focus on the $2 million profit. So, how could you use that $2 million? Well, one way is you could effectively occupy your building for a little over 2 years without having to effectively come out of pocket anything. You follow? And or you could use that $2 million,
To buy another one.
well, that, or to stock, to initially stock the facility without having to come out of pocket. You follow? So, you know, there's a handful of ways that that money could be used by you as Walgreens up front to make the transaction appealing to you. You know, whether you're gonna have the money, you know, where you don't have to worry about the rent for the first couple of years, whether you maybe use it to pre-stock the store, whether you maybe use it to start effectively another, you know, location somewhere else, or a combination of all of those. But the idea behind it is that, you know, it's potentially a great way to kind of put yourself in business to a certain extent. Now, granted, you're going to be having to make these payments, you know, out of your operating cash flows from the business for the next, you know, 25 years. But, you know, ultimately the idea is it's worth it to you to maybe get that upfront profit. Make sense? Okay, somebody had a question, I thought, back there somewhere. I thought I saw a hand go up. No? Okay. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. What?
Are we responsible for knowing how to do that computation?
Absolutely. If you don't, you're in trouble.
Should we do it on Excel?
No. Okay. So, any thoughts, comments, observations about this?
So you would compare that to now what you're gonna pay in rent?
Yeah. I mean, you sort of look at it as, well, okay, what does that work out to be on maybe a per square foot, you know, basis for that particular market with the rents that we'd have to charge? And, you know, that also gets to be kind of a, you know, an interesting thing is that, you know, part of what, you know, as I've said probably over and over again is, you know, the big variable cost is usually going to be the site acquisition cost. Because, you know, once again, acquiring a site in Texas is probably going to be cheaper than acquiring a site in Florida, acquiring a site in downtown Chicago. The construction costs, yeah, are going to be, you know, different as well, depending on union labor, you know, issues and a handful of other things. But yet that may also be made up for by hopefully, you know, greater sales volume in those locations to justify potentially a higher overall rent as well.
Is it possible for those national credit tenants to state on the lease that regardless of what happens to interest rates or where the market is, they're just going to give you a steady 5%?
Yes, I mean, yes, it is possible. You know, in a lot of instances with the ones that I've seen, there's usually some sort of maybe an adjustment that occurs. The question is how often and how much. You know, in some cases, you know, they'll lock it in maybe for a period of 3 years, 5 years, whatever it may be, with then potentially revisiting that depending on specifically what the prevailing rates are at that particular point in time. Okay? Make sense? Okay. All right, let's do this. It's 10 o'clock, a little bit after. Let's take another 5-minute break. Hey, how are you? Ah, nice to meet you.
I was wondering, I thought
If you want to, you can sit wherever you want. A lot of these seats are sort of taken, but if you're going to be just hanging out for a little while, then you may want to sit, back there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Just you can grab a chair and pop it wherever you want it.
Okay, thank you.
And then feel welcome to talk to the folks in the class.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Do we have a midterm next weekend?
We do.
On the 1 through 8?
We do.
Is that gonna be on?
Everything we've talked about today, and
It's all in the book. So we go with what we talked about.
None of the actual project, all right?
Don't say that.
Our graduation in the morning or in the afternoon. I don't know, I need to figure out who to contact.
It's
because
kind of-
there's two for the business school.
Yeah.
I don't know which one it is. It's also the last day of school for teachers, and I have a teacher, my mom's the principal, so they're trying to figure it out, and I have no idea.
honestly, I don't know. I mean, I think it was, what, was it June 11th or 17th, or, it's a Thursday, I think.
Yeah, no, I think it's Friday.
Oh, okay. I thought it was Thursday. So you're June 11th, so I think I've got it on my
Maybe
calendar.
I was looking at the wrong thing.
Nope, I've got it as June the 11th from 10 to noon.
No.
That's what I've got. Yes, sir.
The absolute ground, there isn't that much difference.
Because
You lay it out.
technically though, you don't own the improvements with the ground
Until
lease.
after.
Yes,
However, you have no responsibilities.
you'd have no responsibilities.
You still collect your check.
You still collect your check,
No
but
responsibility.
there might still be some residual issues, and I'm not sure how significant those residual issues might be.
As far as ground, underneath the ground, I mean,
I'm
there has to be a little difference, right?
there's gotta be, I'm not sure what.
Or maybe absolute just refers to the fact that you actually build a building versus the ground you don't. Maybe it's just pre-development stage.
I guess the one way of looking at it, it's just that term is what has been used. It may in effect be pretty much, the same sort of thing, it's just
From the
that,
point of occupancy,
right.
yeah, I was trying to figure it out.
Yeah, Thursday, June 11th from 10 to noon.
So this is what I was looking at, if you look at the website,
Okay,
and you go down to business school, they have two graduations.
that's interesting, because they get, I swear to God, that's why I work there. Huh.
And there's two, and if you look, it's like one says no idea.
Okay, well, let me, that's why I can find out, because that is new information to me, because the folks that actually schedule everything, they have been dealing with this and told us like a couple months ago, that's what it was.
And you know, we have like at one point, we have to register and
I would attempt to.
Syllabus.
like who,
Well, what I'm saying is, I would attempt to do it, and then see what response.
I mean, I just don't know how to do it, like you have to have process, you go to this website, you
Yeah,
fill this out.
you do,
and that's-
that is on there. I'm not going to do it, obviously, but yeah, there is a process where you can file for graduation. But I don't know what specific, which website or which location it is.
And we're supposed to be taking all of us this semester.
Correct.
Because one of them sounded like you're
Which one?
I'm not very good at it.
like.
Oh, this one is more design.
Okay, no, that's fine, I just wasn't sure if it was maybe
No,
processing.
no.
Okay.
Hey, how you doing? Fred. Yes, I am. Yep. Well, good to meet you. Yep. Actually, I think one other person is sitting in a little bit today, and she may have stepped out for a couple seconds to the restroom. But just make yourself home. I'm just on a quick little break, bathroom break, and we'll get started back here in a few minutes.
This is two. Yeah, Kevin's still partying. He was partying yesterday.
I was in my bed and it was so cold. I love hearing that.
Oh, okay. At 2 o'clock.
I come in every Friday.
What is it on here?
For the final presentation of our project, we're just basically leafing it up and presenting it.
Correct.
And then we also have an example of textbook as well.
Correct.
What would that example?
What we talked about in class, and ultimately just kind of getting those concepts down. And then also the computations.
Did you really?
Yeah, we all grew up. Yeah.
I would assume, from what comments that last time I saw was just 2 weeks ago. I think what it's she's gonna know.
Actually, I met this guy. Really nice guy. So I'm hoping, I gotta mention it.
So, he assigned us a project. That one, I know the big
They don't have a lot of projects. They were going to use it, so got rid of all the residential.
Okay, cool. All right. Okay, let's go ahead and get started.
Any nice letters you can write on
Energy prices jump up.
that was really good, by the way, that last one, thank you.
Yeah. I got a mystery flavor. Oh man.
I haven't had it so long.
I go to this sushi place, it's called Thompson.
You went to the sushi place, we have sushi Saturday.
Yeah, I know. I have issues.
It's on him.
I'm getting the filet mignon.
This time, you guys.
Can they have a filet mignon? Bottle of wine?
Alright, and Ryan.
Okay. On.
We like open walk up to the thing. Oh,
Ryan, I think he's a big talker, bro.
All right, one of the things that we obviously talked about, we just finished up talking about the idea of kind of this whole thing of a sale leaseback and that sort of thing. Now let's kind of go back. One of the things that we talked a little bit about the first day was financial feasibility. And that's going to be one of the things, obviously, it's going to be fundamental for you guys to be focusing in on. Obviously, you've got the little test coming up here in the next week or so. So we need to kind of focus in on that aspect of sort of computations that you're going to need to do, and kind of the thought process that you're going to need to go through in doing the financial feasibility. So let's kind of start with how you should be looking at this. You've obviously got a financial Excel model that I developed, and we obviously went through on that first day. But I also want you to be able to do this by hand, okay? And I want you to be able to kind of think through the thought process of going from one step to the next of how do you do these calculations, and ultimately how do you come up with an answer for what the rental rate that you potentially would need, or what the most amount that you could spend up front with regard to construction and that sort of thing. So let's kind of start out, and let's say that we have a property that we're looking to build, and kind of using the previous example a little bit, let's say that our acquisition cost for the land is $1 million, and let's say that our construction budget is $7 million. So our total investment is going to be $8 million. Okay? Now, what do we need to start doing to kind of tear that apart to get at what our rents are? Well, if you sort of look back at the model, one of the things you're going to have to do is look at what is the financing structure that we're going to put into place for this particular sort of deal. Now, assume that we've already gone through, we've got our construction loan, we've already kind of satisfied all of that. We're really looking at the permanent financing side of things. All right? So a few key pieces of information that we're going to need to know are our loan-to-value ratio and our debt service coverage ratio. All right? And if you remember, the formula for the debt service coverage ratio we said was net operating income over annual debt service, and the loan-to-value ratio is what? Loan amount divided by
Value.
overall value of the property. Okay? So, to start us off, one of the things that we're going to have to consider is, well, how much equity we're going to have to put into this deal in terms of our own money versus how much money are we going to borrow in terms of the debt associated with the property. So to keep things relatively simple, let's assume that the lending ratio that we're going to use for the loan to value is going to be 85%. Maybe a little bit high, but let's go with 85%. All right? So what does that mean? If we assume that this is our overall total investment from the developer's point of view, then 85% of this, then this is going to be our actual loan amount. All right? So we get 6.8 million as our loan amount. Okay, everybody good with that? Okay, now we need to know what are the actual loan terms. Okay, so specifically, we need to know the length of the loan, and we're going to assume in this case this is going to be for 20 years. And we need to know the interest rate, and we'll go with 5% as our interest rate. Okay? Now, we're also going to make the assumption this is going to be monthly payments. All right? So what we're going to do, we're going to sort of start off, we're going to put in 6.8 million. Put in 12 payments per year using the financial calculator. Put in 6.8 million as our present value or our loan amount. We'll put in our interest rate of 5%. Put in our term, 20 shift in, and then solve for the monthly payment, and then we need to multiply that by 12 to get our annual payment or our annual debt service, okay? Okay, so we get 44,876.99 for the monthly debt service. Multiplied by 12 gives us $538,523.88. Okay, everybody matching up with me so far? Okay, now, if that's our annual debt service, in other words, the total amount of principal and interest that we're going to be paying on the loan, we can now go up here to our debt service coverage ratio model, plop that in. It's 538, 523.88, and then we need to know what is going to be the minimum debt service coverage ratio that the lender is going to require. So let's say they're going to require 1.3, okay? Now what that means, if you remember, a 1.3 debt service coverage requirement means that your net operating income, or the income that the property throws off each year after expenses, has to be 30% greater than the annual debt service that the property is going to have to service each year. In other words, the lender wants to make sure that you've got more than enough income to be able to pay off that debt service each year. So all we're going to do is take and multiply that 538,523.88 times 1.3, and that's going to give us a net operating income that we're going to need off this property of $700,081.05 rounded. Okay? Everybody get that? Okay. So now that we have the $700,000 as our net operating income, we have to do what? Work backwards from that to find out effectively what is going to be the required amount of rent that we're going to have to charge on this property in order to get to that number, okay? So let's erase a little bit of this, or I mean, I can work down here, I guess, a little bit. All right, because if you remember, we've got potential gross income on our operating statement. We subtract out vacancy and collection losses. We add in other income, which gives us our effective gross income. We subtract out total operating expenses, which gives us then our net operating income. And then if we were to subtract out our annual debt service, then that would give us our before tax cash flow. Okay, everybody remembers that. So what numbers do we actually have out of this sort of portion of the income statement? Well, we now have what our net operating income would need to be, which would be the $700,081.05. And we've got the annual debt service number of 523.88. And we can go ahead and do the math of just simply finding out what our before tax cash flow is, because we're going to actually want that as well, okay? So let's go ahead and find out what that value is. So we get 161,557.17, okay, as our before tax cash flow, which is simply the amount of money that we would have available to us each year after we have paid all of our expenses and ultimately paid what we owe the lender in terms of our mortgage payment. But now the challenge is for us to sort of say, all right, this is the net operating income that we have to calculate in order to, for this project to be feasible or to be solid. So we've got to go literally and make a set of assumptions that will take us back to what our potential gross income number is, okay? Which effectively then would be divided by our square footage to ultimately come up with what our rental rate would be, all right? So we sort of start off and make a handful of assumptions. And once again, we're looking at this as the developer slash investor, okay? Now, in terms of operating expenses, okay, we can make an assumption that if this property is effectively an absolute triple net lease, what operating expenses do we have on this property? None. Zero. Okay? So we can just put a big zero there. All right? And that means that our effective gross income is going to be the same as our net operating income. So 700,000, 08105. All right? And then we also make the assumption that our other income, that for this particular property type, doesn't really have any other ancillary income, so we can put a zero there. All right? So now all we're really left with is this business of calculating what our vacancies and our collection losses are to basically back solve for our potential gross income. All right, well now, then this begins to be, if we kind of go back and we look at this as if this were one of the sale leaseback sort of situations, we're occupying the entire space, then technically there's no vacancy and collection loss, is there?
No.
Okay, so we got a zero there. So this one has been pretty simple in the sense we don't really have to do much other than something go back. Now we have our potential gross income of the 700,000, 08105. But that tells us, all right, that's how much we need to generate in terms of the lease amount on an annual basis, but still doesn't tell us what is the rental rate that we need to charge. Okay, well that is obviously going to be dependent upon how large of a space that we're actually talking about here. So let's just say that, for simplicity's sake, we're talking about a 10,000 square foot building. Okay, so all we would do is basically take that 700,000, 08105 divided by 10,000 square feet, okay, and then we would get, okay, so we're going to get $70.01. This is the rent per square foot, okay, absolute triple net. Now that's obviously a really high rent rate. It could be obviously in a location that demands it, but let's just sort of go with that. So what is that ultimately telling us? So based upon this model, we are saying if the market is effectively charging $70 a square foot for rent or higher, the overall market for this particular product type, then this project theoretically is feasible. Does that make sense? Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay. If the market rent, however, for this particular product type is, let's say, 50 or 60 bucks a square foot, then what it's telling us is this project probably doesn't make any sense for us to pursue any further unless we can somehow cut our construction cost or our land cost or somehow get a better deal on our financing, because under this set of parameters, we've got to get 70 bucks a square foot or this project is simply not going to work. Does that make sense to everybody? Yes or no? Okay, questions? Yep.
If you take that if you take the 700,000 and do it at like a 5% cap rate, you get a $14 million valuation.
Yes?
So, I mean, if you did it at 60 bucks, you'd still get over the $8 million that you had invested.
Well, that's assuming you sell it. This is assuming you're effectively, in this case, you're going to be owner occupying it, or you're going to be doing a sale leaseback. But if you actually were able to get that sort of a cap rate for it, then yeah, you could potentially sell it for more than what you've got in it.
No, what I'm saying it though is if you, like, in your example there, you said if it's $60, it's not feasible. But for this particular example, if it was $60, it still would be feasible.
Not under the conditions of what the lender has set up as being feasible. Because the lender is placing certain constraints on you with regard to the loan-to-value ratio and the debt service coverage ratio, which you really have no control over. Now, it's possible that yes, you could, like using sort of the logic that you're sort of saying, that if we kind of go back and we try to do a direct capitalization model, and we sort of say up front that our valuation is $8 million, all right, and we're saying that our income is $700,081.05, then what is our implied cap rate? And so our implied cap rate is 8.75%, okay? But see, the other thing that this also takes into account is you have equity invested in this as well. You've got a 20%, or I'm sorry, 15% equity that you have invested that you're going to be earning a return on as well. So the point of the feasibility is simply in order to meet the requirements of the lender, you've got to achieve this $70 a square foot. Yes, you could make it profitable with a lower rental rate, but it would not meet the preconditions the lender has set aside. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Good question. Okay, others?
So you'd use that other, you'd use the valuation method that Dustin was talking about. If the terms of the loan were unknown, you
Right.
would use Dustin's method just to determine, hey, could this be a profitable venture or not? And then you'd have to plug in loan terms to figure
Yeah,
out.
yes, but the problem is those loan terms in most instances really are going to dictate very specifically what you're going to need to achieve.
Okay.
And there's a little bit of wiggle room there, but not inherently a lot. So
If you're
absolutely.
going to be selling that property, that's what I don't understand. Like, so the loan wouldn't dictate it.
Well, the loan, okay.
Prevent you from.
Well, now, if we're talking
You
about.
do the deal and then you.
Yeah, if we're
you
talking
sell it.
about the buy and hold, that's what I was
Okay,
effectively
okay,
saying.
alright.
Now, if we are effectively going to immediately flip it,
We'll do the sale list.
yeah, if we're gonna do the actual sale leaseback and we're gonna flip it instantly, then the valuation is probably going to be more in the lines of, okay, what is the income the property can generate divided by what is the prevailing cap rate, whatever that might be.
Right.
Or rate of return that we're going to give that investor, and then that's going to imply a value, and then chances are that value
Will be
that
higher.
is going to be higher, because the cap rate here will probably be lower.
Right.
So that would allow you to obtain the lending if you showed that method of valuing it.
Yep, that's the idea. Okay, I mean, there's the beauty of this is and that's why it's called front door, back door. Is the whole idea of being able to go at it from two different directions. You can either start off with, here's what the prevailing rent rate is, and then work to how much could we spend, or the way that we just did it, which is to start off with, here's how much that we spend, what does that mean we have to charge?
Now, is there some kind of arbitrage in there? Because
There's a little bit of wiggle room, as I said. There's a little bit, and the wiggle room comes into play with regard to what are going to be your assumptions on all of the vacancy collection loss issue, the other income, and the operating expenses. Also, you're going to have the wiggle room with respect to what the interest rate is and the loan term.
And your debt service ratio.
Well, this is going to be, for the most part, set by the lender.
Right.
You're not going to be setting that, nor are you really going to be setting the loan-to-value ratio. But to the extent, yes, that you have some control over which lender you choose and what that prevailing rate is that they are going to allow, then yes, those items are going to allow the model to be manipulated a little bit. absolutely. To go between it being feasible or unfeasible. But at least the thought process is if you've been reasonably conservative and you've kind of done a good job of estimating up front, you know, what are your acquisition and construction costs, and you've done a good job of sourcing your loan and getting a reasonable interest rate, and you've done a good job of estimating what all of these other, you know, potential variables are, then hopefully you can feel comfortable that that is giving you an indication of at least whether or not you should pursue it further or not. And that's kind of the whole purpose of this model, is really it's kind of a relatively simple culling tool of being able to kind of say, does it make sense to sort of look at this in more depth and kind of get into more of a discounted cash flow sort of spreadsheet of looking, you know, literally year by year over your specific holding period and looking at what your required rate of return would be. Because one of the things that we haven't done with this is to look at, well, what our annual return would be on our equity, okay? So one of the things that we might want to do is to calculate our before tax return on equity, and there you're going to be looking at what is your annual before tax cash flow divided by your equity invested. Well, in this particular case, we've got before tax cash flow of $161,557.17, and we have invested, where are we, over here, we have to figure out, well, what is 15% of the 8 million, that will be our equity. So our equity is 1.2 million. All right, and so doing the math on that, you get an annual before tax return on equity of 13.5% roughly, which is not bad. Yep.
And that's our cash on cash return?
Effectively, yeah. Okay. Because it's simply saying that at least on a before tax basis, before we have any sort of income tax sort of implications from this, that would be the dollar amount that we're receiving, which is the way that you're going to want to analyze, at least once again, kind of upfront initially to be able to compare one investment against another. The tax implications, which we're going to get into in the investments class next semester, are going to deal with, okay, how do we deal with issues like depreciation, how do we deal with capital gains tax, how do we deal with effectively what we would classify as repair and improvements versus capital expenditures, all that sort of stuff. But for the purposes of just simply saying what is on a before tax basis our rate of return, that's the number that's probably going to be most mission critical to us. Okay?
And you would compare that off your minimum required return, and we tell you to go
Right.
forward.
Exactly. And so that would be an extra element of the feasibility that, for example, your hurdle rate for you as a developer might be 15%. Well, if your minimum hurdle rate is 15%, then even though the project makes sense otherwise, you would effectively say it's not feasible because you haven't met your hurdle rate of 15%. Now, that's not saying you couldn't make a few adjustments to the model and effectively try to get it to the point of where it would meet your hurdle rate. But that's also another thing to kind of, just from a going through the mechanics of doing this, you have to be very careful of. What we're trying to establish here is feasibility. We're not inherently trying to force it to be feasible. Because the tendency that obviously a lot of developers and investors want to have is they want to do what? They want to tweak it every which possible way and are probably unrealistic about whatever the assumptions are that they're making. But in other words, they're saying, it's not really going to cost us $1 million. It might only really cost us $700,000. Our construction cost, yeah, we can cut some corners there, get that down to $4 or $5 million. Yeah, our rent rates are going to be dramatically higher than that, and so forth, so on, and make those overly unrealistic. And yeah, you can make the model work. But the reality is, are you being realistic with those numbers to the point of where you're really truly judging the project's feasibility? Yep.
So in a scenario like this, you want to take the worst case scenario
Yes.
possible numbers?
Well, you can do, I think that is the proper approach, is you sort of take the worst case scenario of the highest overall and inflated sort of construction cost and then the least amount of revenue that you might generate, start off with that.
Right.
And then kind of back away from it a little bit, you know, to sort of stress test the model, to sort of say, okay, if I back off a little bit, how much is that really going to change things? And then, you know, maybe go the opposite direction and say, in the best of all possible worlds, what would it be? And, you know, realizing that reality may be, hopefully, somewhere in the middle. Make sense? Okay. Questions? Yep.
Where did you get that $1,200,000 in equity?
Okay, so the equity, if our total investment was 8 million and we borrowed 85%, that means that 15% of this 8 million was equity. So all I did was effectively take the 8 million, multiplied it by 15%, which would have been our equity, and that's going to give us the 1.2 million. Okay? All right, other questions? Yep.
For the, I know it's not the accounting class, but, so for a land lease, you wouldn't depreciate anything.
Correct.
But on this,
Well,
so on the absolute net,
right.
would you depreciate the building even though you don't have any, because I mean, it will revert back to at some point, potentially.
So,
With depreciation for tax purposes, you don't depreciate land. You depreciate the building, but and this is one of the things we're going to get into in a lot of detail in the investments class, but the super simple explanation is every time there is a new owner of the building, the clock on the depreciation starts over. It starts fresh. Even though it may be extremely unrealistic, it's what happens. And so you may actually have a property that's 10 years old that you're buying, that the original owner of the property has already taken 10 years worth of depreciation, and you're coming into the property, you're starting that clock all over again with what the depreciation term is. And so for a residential investment property, that clock is 27 and a half years. On commercial, it's 39 years. But you're saying, well, where do those numbers come from? Those are just set by effectively the IRS, the federal government, with respect to what are those depreciation terms in the tax code. And those change. Now, they have been the same since I think it's like 1993. But before that, we had what was called accelerated depreciation, where you were able to write things off much quicker, which is part of what got us into the problem we had in the 80s with people investing in property that probably should have never invested, but they were doing so strictly for tax reasons.
So on an absolute net lease, you can depreciate the building,
Yes.
but on a ground lease, you can't.
Well, you don't own the building.
until you would take ownership of it.
Right.
At the end of the ground.
Right.
That's a big benefit between the two.
Yep. Okay. All right. Other
I have
questions?
another question on that.
Yep.
Sorry. On the lease back scenario,
Yep.
do the owner actually get the building back? Once you build the building, you sell it to the person, and then you lease it back, after the 25 years is over, you get the building back?
No. The person that has purchased that building from you, okay, in other words, let's make sure we're keeping the parties straight, like Walgreens, okay? Let's say that you're Walgreens and I am the purchaser of the building. You have developed the building, you have sold the building to me. You are occupying it for the next 20, 25 years. At the end of that 20, 25 years, you can effectively walk away from that building and go and find somewhere else to locate, or you can engage in another lease with me, but I own the building, you know, and so at that point, I can maybe do a serious renegotiation unless there's some preclusion in the original documents that preclude me from doing so.
Okay.
Or I can sell the building, I can tear it down, whatever.
It's your building.
Right,
It's not like the ground lease.
right. Well, but
Well,
even with the ground,
you get the building
You
back,
get the, yeah,
Right.
I know that.
right.
but that's usually, 100 years. or much longer time period than a.
Doesn't have to be, because, you know, in some of the ground leases, you know, we talked a little bit about this, you know, before, that you a lot of times will have institutions like state and local governments, or even federal government for that matter, also family trust, you know, or just folks that just simply want to hold on to the land and don't want to give up possession of the land, you know, engaging in the ground leases. And there's nothing that says a ground lease has to be long-term. The ground lease could be as short as, you know, any other lease. It could be a year, that you've got the opportunity to occupy that space. You know, for, I mean, like the most common ground leases for short-term would be like lake lots. That certainly the case in Texas, where, you know, you'd have a lake, and then you actually are, and in a lot of cases are not allowed to own those, that those are owned by usually one of the governmental entities, and then you would ultimately do like maybe a year-to-year or every few years sort of ground lease, but yet anything you might build that's permanent on that lot would basically, you'd give up at the end of that lease. Okay? Okay, moving on.
Isn't it that way in DC, like in the core part of Washington,
Yeah,
DC, all property is the federal government's, and you just lease?
More than likely, yeah. But I mean,
Like your house,
it's one of those things that there's nothing that precludes somebody from setting up property that they own as a ground lease whenever they sell it off. It's just, there are issues traditionally that have been associated with that, like, for example, the difficulty sometimes in obtaining financing. That's usually one of the big hang-ups that sort of goes into that. But if you're doing the financing in a non-traditional way, and somehow, whatever that non-traditional way is, then a lot of those issues sort of get cast aside. The barrier on the ground lease thing is usually the financing. Okay, because most lenders are not going to be thrilled about you not owning the land and you're building this massive set of improvements on the land.
Mm-hmm.
But now if you're financing it non-traditionally, like for example, if it's especially like a government-owned sort of facility or ground, then you may be issuing, or they may be issuing government bonds on your behalf that you ultimately then would be just simply paying them back. So they're actually not only providing you the land, but they're also providing you with the financing. Okay? All right? All right, other questions on this before we move on? Okay, all right, let's, just for fun, let's take it from the opposite direction. Not really just for fun, but you're gonna have to do this. Okay. Okay, so now the scenario would be flipped, and we would say, all right, we're going to go out into the market and we're going to find out what are the prevailing rental rates. Okay, so we go out into the market and we find that the prevailing rental rates are $50 per square foot, absolute, triple net. Okay. And we make the assumption we've got a 10,000 square foot building. Oops. All right. So that should be what, 5 million? Or 500,000? 50,000? Let's see. 50,000. Yeah, times 10. Yeah, 500,000. Okay, so this number is going to be what? Our potential gross income, yes?
All right.
Okay, so we sort of start off over here. All right, once again, subtract out our vacancy and collection losses, add in our other income, it's going to give us effective gross income, subtract out operating expenses, gives us net operating income, subtract out annual debt service, gives us before tax cash flow. Okay, So yet again, if we sort of approach it this way and we say that, well, maybe this is a little bit of a different kind of property. This one maybe is not going to be owner occupied. All right, this one's actually going to have maybe some vacancies and collection losses associated with it. So let's just say that it is 20% vacancies and collection losses. So that's 100 grand right off the top that we're going to pop off of this. All right, so subtract out 100,000 in vacancies and collection losses. However, we're going to have some other sources of income that's non-traditional rental income. And as we've talked about before, depending on the property type, this could be, things like they're having to pay for parking, they're maybe having to, or we've got income that maybe we're generating off of billboards on the side of the building, or could be like in an apartment complex, it would be things like vending machines, but whatever it is, it's non-core sort of income. And let's say in this particular instance, it's going to be 25,000 that we're going to be adding back in. So 500,000 minus 100,000 is 400,000 plus 25,000 would mean our effective gross income is going to be 425,000. Okay, everybody good with that? All right, now our operating expenses. In this particular instance, we have said it is going to be an absolute triple net sort of situation, so we'll go ahead and keep a 0 there for our total operating expenses. So 425,000. Now, this is where we begin again with what are our assumptions from our lender. Okay, so maybe change those up a little bit from the previous one. We'll say that our debt service coverage ratio this time is maybe going to be a little bit more restrictive, and it's going to be 1.4. Okay? And so we're going to need to know our annual debt service and our net operating income. Well, we know now our net operating income is 425. So now we would need to solve for what is going to be our maximum annual debt service. So instead of doing what we did previously, which was to take the annual debt service and multiply it by 1.4, here we'll do just the opposite. We'll take 425,000 divided by 1.4. And you get 303, 571, 43. Okay? Everybody good? All right. So we'll pop that in over here. Okay, go ahead and subtract it out. And I get 121, 428, 57 as our before tax cash flow. Okay? Everybody still good? All right. Now, what we need to do at this point, however, is we need to back into what our loan amount is, and then ultimately what the overall value of the property would be. Okay? So in that particular case, what we've got to do is we're going to start with this annual debt service number and work our way backwards. So we'll take that number, the 303, 571, 43, and we will divide it by 12 in order to get our monthly debt service. Okay, this is our annual debt service, so we need to get our monthly debt service, or monthly payment, if you will. So you get 25,297.62 as our monthly debt service. Okay? So now we're going to put that into the financial calculator, back solve. So start fresh here. So 12 payments per year on the calculator. Put in 25,297.62 as our payment amount. Now, also with this term, we've got to figure out what our loan terms are, okay? how many years, and at what interest rate. So let's assume that on this one, we're going to maybe have a little bit of a higher interest rate, so maybe 6%. And the loan term on this one is going to be shorter, 15 years. Okay, and then we're going to be solving for the loan amount or present value. And so we get a present value of almost $3 million. It's actually $2,997,856.88. Okay, right, matching up to that?
Yep.
Okay. Now, once again, what does that represent? That only represents the loan amount. Okay, well, if we kind of go back, this won't work any better, and we say that we have a loan to value ratio that the lender is telling us we can borrow, let's say 80%. All right, so what would we do? We would take this loan amount and we would divide it by 80%, and that's going to give us the overall value. Okay, so in this case, 2,997,856.88 divided by 0.8 give us our value of $3,747,321.10. Okay, everybody good with that? Okay, so now what we would have to do is to then say, what can we actually buy and build the space for? So assuming that our land cost are, let's say 747,321.10 would mean that our construction budget could be $3 million. Okay, and then we would have to say, all right, if this building is also, just happens to be a 10,000 square foot building, so divided by make sure we don't screw it up. $300 a square foot. Construction cost. Okay, so from the perspective of this one, we would say, all right, if we can buy our land for the 747, and our construction budget is $3,300,000 per square foot for construction cost, if the construction costs for this particular property type are less than $300 a square foot, this is feasible. If the construction costs for this particular property type are greater than $300 a square foot, not feasible, okay? And just like the previous situation, we can obviously go in and tweak any of these sort of numbers and ultimately see what is the resulting impact for the property and whether or not it's really going to affect the overall feasibility, okay? So everybody understand what we have done? Okay, it's just basically the flipping of the previous one. Okay. Thoughts, questions, observations? Okay, let's do this. Let's take a 5-minute break and then we'll come back and we've got some new stuff to cover. Come on, get up, move.
I guess in a different way, they can just.
Or you can just have, once again, you have somebody that's effectively the building owner, and they would, just effectively make payments to the building owner for the building owner, once again, just looking for, cash flows. But it frees up, the business of them having to be in the business of actually, owning it long term.
But the way this particular semester is set up is but the other time, this semester is a little different. They're all kind of
Yeah, I mean, just to make a point, but I mean, ultimately, the idea wasn't to come back to this, just simply to say, is it reasonable for this particular property type, whatever this property type is,
To pay.
$300. If your construction costs are gonna be greater than that, this is not gonna make sense. At that rate.
I have a quick question. This right here, the value that was quoted.
Take the loan out, divide it by 80%, because we're borrowing 80% of the total, so you're backing into the number.
Right.
And this particular semester, it's more in full.
Well, that's what it's.
Yeah, that's kind of, that's,
Yeah, but that's, yeah.
specifically for me, for this. That's, totally different.
We have to, I know it's for the other contract, if you have, we're confused with the dates that are due.
Yeah, all the Project Pro stuff, talk together. Email
Okay.
them.
And, but one of those is part of, the MIT project is part of.
Well, yeah,
Because you
that's the
want us to
project,
use that
that's the,
with Project Pro.
right,
Okay, okay, that's what we thought, so it's not for this class, it's for him.
right,
And in the papers for him too, not for you.
correct.
Okay, so we just have to ask them what do they, because there's two things due, and we don't know if they're doing something or not.
I thought it was on the syllabus that he gave you. The syllabus
It's
that-
not, it just says the third Wednesday of or the Wednesday before the or something. It's very confusing. He's not giving.
Okay, well,
us-
just
Yeah.
email it. Don't respond.
Okay, good.
Before you go to the interest rate, will be given, LTV will be given a number of,
It's part of the financial, right?
Well, this is the development feasibility. So this is for this class with this example. See, some people aren't involved in both.
and we're gonna have both final, right?
For this class, for the development. Was, actually, it's a midterm, but yeah. Which is gonna be actually next week.
Next week.
Which is why we're going over this. Okay, let's everybody get back. Get everybody out of the hallway, working. Okay, let's go.
I think that's the other class. What is the semester over?
March 21st is our last day.
What class are we in right now?
Development, all day.
One or two?
This is a combination. But it's the one that's gonna matter for your test next week.
I know.
We're, because then we'll be able to take it, so we're gonna, I'm gonna.
So we still didn't take it.
Yeah, so he's gonna take it this week and then I'll.
No, I heard you.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, because this week is purely development.
This afternoon,
Whatever other material we've got to cover before we.
MS
No, that has nothing to do with this.
It's gonna be less material.
Right.
So I can potentially just wash it.
Right.
Okay, good.
Okay, let's get started. All right, what we're gonna do now, shift gears, completely move away a little bit from the conceptual, or not the conceptual, move away from the computation stuff and do a little bit of conceptual. And what we're gonna do at this point, I passed out to you earlier today one of several different trade publications, whether it was Shopping Center Today, Commercial Investment Real Estate Journal, or Urban Land Magazine. And the idea that I want you to explore for the next probably 10 minutes or so is I want, last one, sorry.
I apologize. I'm sorry.
So basically what I want you to do is to look through this particular trade publication, and these represent the major organizations that obviously are affiliated with the real estate development industry. The ones I've, for the most part, there are a couple of exceptions here. Urban Land is one of them that I've passed out, which is put out by the Urban Land Institute. The Commercial Investment Real Estate Journal, that one is put out by CCIM. Also, I think I put out one, I'm trying to remember the name of it, but by Cornet Global, which is kind of more corporate real estate. Another that I think I put out there was shopping centers today, put out by the International Council of Shopping Centers, obviously a pure focus on the retail side of things. And then I may have given somebody a South Florida Business Journal, and also one put out by the Realtors Association, and maybe one or two others. But the general idea is that each of these, are publications that come out either, monthly, typically monthly, and have articles of interest to people, obviously within different aspects and different specializations within the industry. Some coming in probably from the Urban Land and the Commercial Investment Real Estate Journal, but more specifically, Urban Land is almost exclusively development focused, okay? Whereas the Commercial Investment Real Estate Journal, a little bit more kind of from the investor side of things, and maybe tax issues and a handful of other sort of ownership related issues. The Coronet is going to be focused on, once again, kind of corporate real estate ownership and the unique issues and challenges faced by those folks. And then the Shopping Centers Today, once again, kind of focused on the retail side of the business. South Florida Business Journal, just kind of a local sort of good source of what projects are occurring now, who's involved with those projects, maybe some of the details of those. Always kind of a good source for keeping up with what's going on in the local market. And then lastly, kind of the Realtors Association, just kind of issues related to sort of the sales aspect of the profession. So what I'm asking you to do is to kind of flip through the one that you've been given and kind of take a look at some of the articles that are included there. And let's spend just a few minutes on kind of talking about some of those issues, kind of facilitate a little bit of a discussion and see if there's anything that kind of pops out to you that's of specific interest, okay? Has everybody got one of them to look at? Okay, you guys came in late.
They're online, right? I can look up online.
Yeah, you could look up online, or actually, why don't you guys partner with somebody? I don't care, you can rip the magazine apart if you have to. Here you go, you can share this one. Okay, so take just a few minutes. And while you're doing that, I'm going to put some schedule stuff up here. I know some of you have been asking about a couple things.